Opening the queen's flank establishes early spatial pressure and prepares for queenside expansion. Embracing a fianchetto, black prepares to activate their bishop on the long diagonal, potentially creating counterplay against white's center. Opening the center dramatically challenges black's fianchettoed bishop and threatens immediate central space. Carving out a queenside space with c5 immediately challenges white's central grip and initiates a fascinating symmetrical pawn structure battle. Developing knights early often prepares for a central pawn push, aiming to seize more space. Unlocking the queenside, this knight creates dynamic counterplay and challenges white's central ambitions, aiming for a balanced position. Opening this central diagonal with the pawn immediately challenges black's queenside pawn structure. Opening the central diagonal immediately allows pieces to eye key squares and creates dynamic pawn exchanges. Recapturing the pawn opens diagonals for white's bishops and establishes central influence. Developing the knight to a natural square now challenges white's central pawn and prepares for kingside castling. Reinforcing central control, this knight further solidifies white's foothold amidst the pawn storm, promising further development. Exchanging knights here opens diagonals and prepares a central pawn push, seeking to exploit the slightly less developed kingside. Opening the queen aggressively secures the d-pawn's advance, creating immediate central pressure while black redevelops. Solidifying the pawn structure while preparing to develop the bishop toward the kingside is a sensible plan. Developing the bishop to this square now controls the central squares and prepares for castling, aiming for a comfortable kingside position. Developing the bishop here unlocks diagonals and prepares for castling, reinforcing the pawn structure. Solidifying the center and preparing to castle kingside, this move quietly develops a piece, maintaining a balanced position. Securing the king's safety is paramount, a wise defensive maneuver before white can launch a central pawn storm. Repositioning the queen to d2 aims for safer squares and supports a potential kingside pawn storm. Boldly challenging the center, this piece redistribution aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially pry open lines toward the king. Exchanges the active bishop for a knight, simplifying while opening the g-file and potentially exposing black's king. Reclaiming that piece decisively opens the g-file for your rook and targets white's misplaced queen. Securing the outpost on d4, white aims to restrict black's minor pieces and build pressure on the kingside. Re-establishing the bishop's diagonal presence, this move repositions the defender to influence the center more effectively and prepare for future queenside activity. Sacrificing pawn structure for bishop pair's long-term advantage creates dynamic counterplay. Recapturing on g7 relinquishes the fianchetto's defensive shield, exposing the king to potential central pressure and opening aggressive possibilities for white's queen. Castling now secures the king behind a solid pawn shield, preparing for central action and unifying the rooks. Seeking a safer haven, the king abandons the vulnerable central files, anticipating potential tactical skirmishes. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure offers a safe haven for the rook and prepares for potential expansion. Unlocking the queenside diagonal, black seeks to disrupt white's centralized control and explore attacking possibilities. Initiating an aggressive pawn thrust to seize central space, potentially trapping black's queen and creating attacking opportunities. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure offers a degree of refuge, though it slightly hinders the knight's potential future deployments. Unyieldingly, the rook anchors to the flank, preparing to contest the crucial open file and potentially pressure the weakened kingside. Relocating the monarch to h8 secures the king behind the f-pawn, offering a safer haven. Preparing to seize the e-file, white aims to activate the rook and challenge black's passive piece placement. Reclaiming the g-file allows your rook to actively participate, preparing for a future skirmish on that open line. Sensing danger around the king, white repositions the rook to defend, subtly preparing to challenge the open files and create counterplay. Securing the crucial c-file with the rook immediately tightens black's grip on the center and opens avenues for pressure. Initiating a pawn sacrifice to pry open the kingside and exploit black's slightly exposed monarch. Trading queens here, black hopes to simplify and avoid a potential king hunt, though it offers white slightly better pawn structure. Simplifying into a rook endgame, the idea is to exploit the open d-file and pressure black's queenside pawn structure. Trading off the bishop removes a key defender of white's king and opens lines for black's remaining pieces. Dominating the d-file securely, white now aims to exploit black's isolated pawns. Initiating control over the c-file with the rook immediately challenges white's central pawn structure and prepares for potential breakthroughs. Exploiting the open file, white injects life into the queenside battle with this pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for attack. Opening the e-file offers black a chance to activate their rook, but it also creates a pawn weakness that can be exploited later. Opening the f-file now seizes a critical line, potentially pressuring black's cramped king. Seeking active play, black repositions the rook, aiming to contest the open file and avoid passive defense. Repositioning the king to a safer square, aiming to improve its influence in the coming endgame skirmishes. A proactive stance to seize the open files and challenge white's pawn structure. Seizing the open file now forces black into a passive defensive posture. Sacrificing the pawn to open lines for your rook and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure is a bold, yet strategically sound, decision. Focusing on king safety, this repositioning seeks a better square for the monarch amidst the tense pawn structure. Probing the open d-file offers an immediate outpost for your rook. Repositioning the king to a more active central square aims to support the rooks and seize initiative. Bringing the monarch back to the relative safety of the kingside, away from any immediate threats on the d-file. Propelling the monarch forward unlocks potential outposts and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure. Bringing the king closer to the action prepares for potential pawn advances and central pawn breakthroughs. Capturing the pawn reclaims material equality and offers a more open board for white's remaining pieces. Unleashing a desperate check, black seeks to disrupt white's encroaching king and perhaps create counterplay on the d-file. Trading rooks simplifies the position, aiming to exploit the passed pawn and king activity. Unlocking the central pawn opens up the file for your rook, creating immediate pressure on white's king. The white king ventures boldly into enemy territory, seeking to dominate the center and capitalize on its advanced position. Unleashing a rook check now aims to disrupt white's king, seeking any immediate compensation for the lost pawn. Securing the crucial square grants the monarch the vital escape route needed to evade immediate danger. A proactive retreat aims to centralize the rook, seeking active participation in the endgame's pawn struggles. Grabbing the pawn opens a critical diagonal, though watch out for black's active rook. This rook sacrifice is a bold attempt to create queenside counterplay by opening lines towards white's exposed king. Pawn push aggressively secures territory, threatening to advance further and corner the black king. The rook's presence on the second rank now becomes a significant nuisance, threatening to sever the king's escape route. Propelling the pawn forward immediately claims crucial territory, aiming to disrupt black's consolidating rook. Initiating a pawn storm on the queenside now presents an opportunity to activate the rook and contest the open file. Expanding the queenside pawn chain aims to outflank black's rook and create a passed pawn threat.